All right. Well, with all that, I think that's settled. So let me hand it over to Doug to introduce our main guest for this evening, to our main presentation, and our guest who's doing our main presentation. Because I think, Doug, you wanted to go ahead and introduce him.
Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend John Reiser, WQ4L. I've known John since 2010. That 2010 was the year in which I came back to amateur radio after a 40-year absence, and joined the Quarter Century Wireless Association, where John was active, and I've been active since. Well, some years ago, I don't remember exactly how many, one of the things we did in the Quarter Century Wireless Association was invite a couple of folks who had, radio-related careers to tell us some stories about their career. And in that series, my favorite was John Reiser's presentation. John was an FCC field engineer. So he sometimes drove a truck with a direction finder on the top and tried to resolve problems that were reported to the Federal Communications Commission. I think he has some of those stories for us tonight, and some of the things you might find in textbooks, but mostly not, and a lot of interesting observations of some human behavior that was sometimes pretty far out of line. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John. I will mention that after his presentation, we said, okay, well, our meeting time is up, but we want you back next month because we'd like to hear more of this. That's the only time that ever happened at Quarter Century Wireless. So, John, please go ahead and take it away.
First of all, I want to thank Doug for inviting me to be with you. I've had a lot of fun with the Winterfest, and over the years, and known Doug in QCWA. And I might mention that John Keene, who is a guest here tonight, is a very, very good friend of mine. He's a retired engineer from the research branch of the National Public Radio, but he's also worked as a consulting engineer for several engineering firms in the Washington, D.C. area. And he's also, I've known him many years when we were working on common problems for non-commercial educational radio expansion services many years ago. And I think I've known John for must be at least 40 years, I think. Anyway, a little bit about my career. I started working for the Federal Communications Detroit Field Office in 1961. And I was only at the Detroit office for about 4 years and was transferred to Buffalo, New York as the assistant engineer in charge. And then 2 years later, I was promoted to the engineer in charge of the Buffalo field office, and stayed until 1975, at which time I was transferred to Washington, D.C. as the chief of the operator examination and licensing branch, and then the inspections branch of the Field Engineering Bureau. In 1976, I then left the Field Engineering Bureau and went to the Broadcast Bureau and worked in broadcast engineering, the rules and standards, or the policy and rules division, where we wrote the technical rules and modified them and so on, and issues dealing with broadcast matters. Well, over the years, we introduced ill-fated AM stereo. Of course, color TV was coming in just in the late 1960s, and we were doing a lot of inspections on stations converting to color television. But anyway, that is sort of my background. Now, the stories that I tell you occurred many years ago, and of course, a lot has transpired since then. both the rules for broadcasting and operations and amateur radio and so on have completely changed over the years. But the things that I'm telling you about probably occurred between 1960 and perhaps 1980. So they're all about 20 to 30 years or more ago. The Field Engineering Bureau, or the Field Bureau of the Federal Communications Commission, had really about 5 major responsibilities. One was to primarily to investigate complaints or problems of interference, particularly to radio services that involve the safety of life and property. The secondly was to inspect and monitor stations and communications for compliance with the rules and regulations. And a lot of our work was inspecting ship stations, which were required by international treaty to be inspected at least once a year to comply with the International Safety of Life at Sea regulations. And they also applied to the Great Lakes. So when I was in the Detroit and Buffalo field offices, we did a lot of inspections of ships. And many of my adventures were being on ships or being thrown overboard. But anyway, the other thing was to conduct the radio amateur and commercial operator license examinations. Of course, at that time, the FCC was conducting all of the amateur examinations as well as examinations for the first, second, and third class radio operator licenses, both radio telephone and radio telegraph. And except for, I think, the conditional amateur licenses, which were a special provision for those who lived long distances from an operating examination point. And one of my jobs, of course, was to travel to cities like Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, of course, and give radio amateur and commercial operator license examinations on a quarterly basis. And so if you've ever held a commercial license, you know about those examinations. And of course, we also answered a lot of inquiries from the public about radio and the rules, and took all kinds of complaints from the list. A lot of them had to do with broadcast and broadcast programming and obscene language and other situations. So we were busy answering the telephones in our field offices, just answering inquiries and possible complaints of various kinds, or just inquiries. We sent out forms and assisted station engineers in answering their questions and helping whatever we could. So quite a variety of work in the field office. Well, I'll tell you some of the things that happened for amateur radio. One of the very first things that happened to me in Detroit was that we got a call from some amateurs that there was an unlicensed fellow operating on 10 meters. And it happened that they knew who this fellow was. So they went to the, they called and said, this guy is unlicensed, but he's been interfering with our 10-meter net. So we found out who he was, and I decided, well, we would go out and talk to the fellow. He was a high school student. So I went out late in the afternoon when I knew that he would probably be home. And I knocked on the door of the home, and a lady answered, and I explained that I was from the Federal Communications Commission, and I wanted to see the son, the boy, about his radio operation. And the lady said, oh, yes, he's expecting you. Well, that really surprised me. So I said, well, could you show me where he is? And she said, yeah, he's upstairs in his room. He's working on his radio. So I went upstairs, followed her up, and when I got in, I said, I'm John Reiser from the Federal Communications Commission. Well, first of all, he said, hey, Bill, what did you get for question number 4? And it turns out that he was doing his own novice exam, and he and his friend, Bill, were both doing it at the same time, and he was expecting Bill to come over so they could do the exam together. There was no supervision, and of course, did his face turn red, and he said, how on earth did you know what I was doing? And I said, we just had an intuition. But anyway, I had him sign his exam, the answer paper, I stapled it together, and I said, we understand you've been operating on 10 meters unlicensed. You better cut it out. So that was my very first experience with ham radio operation and licensing when I first started working for the FCC in 1961. So that was one of the first experiences. Now, we've had, as I mentioned, that we've had a lot of strange interference cases. And one that Doug reminded me about was a little old lady who lived out in a town, I think it was Maysville, Ohio. No, Maysville, Kentucky. Maysville, right across the river from Ohio, was getting interference to her TV set every afternoon when she had one of her favorite soap operas on, and it has happened that it interfered every Friday afternoon about the same time, between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And she called or wrote to us and said, the smoke every Friday afternoon is causing terrible interference to my TV set. So we thought that was sort of strange, didn't think anything about it, but we wrote her back a letter and said, well, it might be a long time before we get somebody in your area, particularly on a Friday, but we'll put it in our file, and the next time we're in Ohio and Kentucky, we will we'll try and look at it for you. But it only occurred one day a week. So it turns out that we had another investigation going on in that particular area about 6 months later. So we wrote back to the lady and said, we're going to be in your area on such and such a day, and we'll be there on a Friday. So I went in and we made the appointment, and I went into her home, and she had cookies and brownies and everything ready for me. And it was sort of strange. She was a retired school teacher. And sure enough, we started watching the TV set about 3:30, and then the set started getting snowier and snowier and real staticky, and the audio started making a real staticky noise. And it lasted for when it started getting back, she went to her window and opened up the curtains, and there about a block away, I could see a big plume of white steam. So I listened on our portable receivers that we had in the car, our TV set and our receivers, our broadband receivers, and our spectrum analyzer, and I took off and drove over. And as I got towards that where that steam was coming from, the racket was just terrible. Well, it turns out that this factory had installed a electrostatic soot precipitators to cut down the smoke or the soot that their smokestack eliminated. But every Friday afternoon, they put steam through it to flush out and wash out the soot that had accumulated at the bottom of this precipitator. And it was the water that was arcing in this high voltage soot precipitator that they were using to collect the soot from one of their manufacturing processes. So she wasn't wacky at all. it was really that what she was seeing was not smoke, but it was the steam. So we told the factory, well, what you better do is do this about 3 o'clock in the morning when no one is watching TV, and that'll take care of the problem. So that was one of the strange cases that we had as far as interference is concerned. Now, we got a call from the Ohio Telephone Company and saying, we have been getting a lot of complaints from a certain area near Maple Heights, Ohio, of people getting AM radio in their on their phones, and we have to go out and put filters on their phones to get rid of this voice interference that's coming in on the phones. But the thing is, the fellow said it's sort of unusual because we only hear this usually on weekends and sometimes in the evenings, but not very often. And it's rock and roll music, and we hear kids and so on. But they give a call sign of WHMR radio, and we looked it up, and we don't see that there was a station on 1440 in this area, but that's when it's operating. So we checked, and of course there was no station WHMR, and so we went down and looked into it. Well, it turns out that it was a young fellow about 22 years old that had an AM 10-watt transmitter that he had in his garage, and he had an antenna on his roof and wire all over his yard for an antenna. And he was pretending he was a disc jockey, and he played a lot of records, and he had a lot of high school kids come over, and they were operating on Saturday afternoons, Sunday afternoons, in the evening sometime, but it was strictly an unlicensed operation. And so the first thing we did was send him a cease and desist order, our usual 301 violation letter to stop operating. And he did for a while, and then it started up again. The first thing, the telephone company called us. Well, since he started operating again, the next time we went down, I went to the U.S. Attorney's office, and the attorney said, well, just write him a letter. And we said, well, we already did. And I showed all the correspondence to the U.S. attorney. He said, well, I guess we better get the marshals out. So we sent the marshals out, and the marshals seized all of the equipment, the transmitter, the telephone, the turntables, and all the records and everything having to do with the station. They seized it and took it down to the courthouse building. And of course, the problem was then the kids, the records, all the records that he took belonged to all the kids in the neighborhood, and they all were clamoring and writing letters to us trying to get them back. Well, they were in the possession of the U.S. attorneys, the marshal's office, so I guess they never did get them back. But the fellow had to go to court, of course, and he pleaded nolo contendere and was put on probation. He couldn't operate any radio equipment of any kind for 5 years, and that was but he never did serve any jail time, but that's the outcome of that particular case. Now, when one of the more serious interference was through the aeronautical services. And when I was working in the Buffalo office, the field, we received complaints of a strange interference that occurred only from around 11:30 to 12 o'clock each weekday. And then on certain week evenings, from 8 to 8:30, about 2 days a week, usually Tuesdays or Thursdays, and it interfered with the instrument landing system of the Pittsburgh airport, certain frequencies at around 109 megahertz. Well, the FAA called us and told us that they had were getting the interference and could hear it, and that it was coming from a location about 15 miles west of Pittsburgh. And they wanted us to come down and DF it and see if we could find it. And they gave us a schedule of when it was generally heard. Now, they expected that it was probably a spurious from a broadcast station, but since it was on sort of a regular schedule, it was rather unusual. So we went down with our DF equipment and went into the area where the signal was heard. And of course, it took us several days because it was only on during the daytime for about a half an hour. And then one evening, I was down and we were still working on it, trying to locate it. And we figured out exactly, we could measure the frequency and we could look at it and see what it was. And we thought that it was a harmonic of a broadcast, some sort of in the broadcast, I think it was around 107, about 110 or 112 megahertz, that it was coming from an oscillator in a TV receiver. And that was exactly what the case was. Well, what we did, we DF'd it, and we were probably within 2 or 3 miles of where the location was. And we were listening to the TV station, Channel 4, and just as we were about to close in on the source, we heard, and now the President of the United States will give a talk. And just as they said, I'm the President of the United States, the signal went off the air. So we had to wait until the next Monday to start looking for the interference again. And we finally DF'd it right to a house. And it turns out that it was, this house had a very high antenna. And the TV set was a Zenith set that the owner of the house had a nephew who had taken a course in TV repairs and had worked on that Zenith TV set, and he had taken the shield off the local oscillator. Well, what was happening was that the signal from the local oscillator or harmonic, the oscillator frequency for the IF was going right up the antenna, and it was going out on a very high gain TV antenna headed right towards Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh airport. So that's what it was. Well, with the FBI, the FCC, and a few other, and the FAA all descended on this house. It really scared the living dates out of them. But what happened was, when I went back and gave the report of what the source was and told the people they couldn't use that TV set any longer, and I finally talked to the somehow or other, the FAA got a hold of Zenith and said it was a Zenith set that was causing this problem, and they were hoping that other sets weren't doing the same. Well, Zenith sent their local dealer out to pick up the set. They took it to the Zenith lab, and they found out that the reason was that the whole shielding on the local oscillator had been left off. They just completely left it off when he replaced tubes and so on in the set. So that was the reason the signal was going back up the transmission line and was radiating out of the antenna. And Zenith repaired the set, put it back in new condition, and shipped it back to the people that owned it. And in the meantime, the dealer gave them a loader set to use while Zenith was. But Zenith was very concerned that there might be something that could have been radically wrong in their circuit design that would cause the local oscillator to radiate the way it did. So at least that case worked out pretty well. Now, another interference to aeronautical services occurred, of all places, in Hazard, Kentucky. And if you ever watched really old TV shows, you'll remember the Dukes of Hazzard. Well, this was the Hazard in Hazard, Kentucky. And it was one of the, I think, American Airlines or one of the airlines had a flight from Chicago to Washington, D.C. And when they were flying over the particular area near Hazard, Kentucky, they were getting interference on their radio communications. So I had to trudge down to Hazard, Kentucky and trance around and see if I could find what the signal was. Well, it didn't take very long to find it. What had happened was the local TV store had installed a booster amplifier and a transmission line on a high hill to pick up convert a UHF station from Lexington, Kentucky to a VHF station, TV station on channel 3 or 4, I'm not sure which. And he ran a transmission line, then a TV transmission line down the hill to about a dozen homes that were down in a valley so that they could get TV. And of course, it enabled him to sell TV sets to this rather isolated little community of about 5 or 6 homes. Well, it didn't take very long for wind and animals and so on to tear down the transmission line. So instead of putting the transmission, replacing the transmission line, what he did was he connected a TV antenna tuned to channel 3 or channel 4, I'm not sure which, to the output of this amplifier, which was he had rigged about. It was a TV converter, a pilot TV VHF or UHF to VHF converter, and then he'd built a little amplifier that boosted it to 4 or 5 watts and put it on the antenna. Well, the thing is, his little transmitter had all kinds of harmonics, and it fell all across the aviation band from, the FM and the aviation band. So it was causing interference to the aeronautical services. And but I didn't want to go by myself, traipsing around the hills of Hazard, Kentucky, because they have a particular home product that's rather popular down there. So I got the sheriff to go with me, and when we found this this transmitter, which was built in he had built it up and included in one of those old metal ammunition cases you could get on the Army surplus, military surplus, and then he said, "Well, I know where this came from. It's the local TV guy built it and installed it, and but he said we'll take care of it so it won't cause any more problem." So he got his .38 service revolver out and shot the darn thing completely full of holes, and that ended that particular interference case. Well, when I got back to his office and we finished things up, I told him, I thanked him for going with me, and the reason I was rather dubious as a federal officer of going around the countryside near Hazard, Kentucky. And he said, "Oh, you mean our local product?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, have you ever tasted it?" And I said, "Well, I'm afraid I haven't." So he got out a typical mason jar and showed it to me. Well, what was I supposed to do? So I thought I would take a little swig of it, just to be sociable, of course. They couldn't figure out why I couldn't talk for a week when I got back to the office. Oh boy, that stuff was burned. I think it took the skin out of my throat. But anyway, it was the one and only time which I have experienced moonshine. But anyway, that was my story in Hazard, Kentucky. And I went on the way back, I stopped at Renfrew Valley. And by the way, there is also a Mount Vernon, Kentucky that I found on that same trip. But anyway, so that was one of my experiences in aviation interference. So one of the things, of course, we do is we investigate criminal activities too, and violations of the law. And every once in a while, you run into someone who really wants to use radio unlawfully or for unlawful purposes. And one of the cases was in Toledo, Ohio. It turns out that there was a serviceman, and he had one or two employees with him. And they had the service contract to service a lot of the radios for the both the police and the fire department, or the sheriff's department and the fire department in the Toledo area. Well, apparently their work wasn't quite satisfactory, so they lost the contract to do the mobile service work for the fire and the police department, or the government agency that held the contract. Well, he was pretty upset about losing the contract, and he said, well, your system will never, we kept it working fine. You're always going to have trouble with it. If you don't do our, if you don't hire us back, you're going to have trouble. So what he did, he took a mobile radio, a repeater, a mobile radio, and he put a timer on it so that when the mobile unit from the police or the fire department came on, his transmitter would go on for about 10 seconds and block the transmission from the handheld, or the fire or the police handheld unit that was trying to communicate back through the repeater system to the base station. And of course, every time they keyed up a mobile unit, his transmitter would come on for just a short period of time, block about the first 10 seconds of the transmission. And of course, it really made it difficult for the public safety people to communicate with each other. And so it didn't take very long for the police department to figure out that something was going on. And they tried to listen, and they finally figured out that something was going on the frequency, causing the interference every time that their transmitter went on. They called us at the Detroit field office, and so we went out and spent quite a bit of time DFing. And the fellow had a mobile, he was operating this unit from a car, not from a fixed location. So he was operating from all different kinds of locations. So it was really hard to pin him down. But finally, after several weeks of trying, we finally were able to close in on him and catch him in the act of sitting in his car with this transmitter that automatically keyed when the public safety station went on the air. Well, of course, we immediately got the U.S. Marshals and arrested him. The FCC does not have arrest authority. We always have to go through the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Marshal, but we got enough evidence to get a warrant, and he was arrested and, of course, was convicted and spent some time in the federal penitentiary for interfering with public safety communications. So that was one of the violations of where there was deliberate malfeasance on the part of a radio technician violating the communications laws. We've had some other interesting things. One was I got a call from a drive-in theater operator, and they said, we found a transmitter on the building of our projection booth. And we thought, well, that's funny. It was in a box and all sealed up and pretty good. So we drove out and we met the operator of the drive-in theater and got a ladder and went up on the top of his projection booth. And there was a box all sealed up with a power cord going to one of the exit light outlets, 110 volts. And then there was an audio line and it went down to, and it was connected to one of the speakers that they had in the front of the projection booth, because they had some benches there where people could, if they didn't want to sit in their cars, they could sit in the benches and they could hear the audio of the movie. Well, we finally disabled the transmitter and left, and we said, will you keep an eye on this and see if some guy doesn't come and to fix it? Oh, we did. We cut the audio line. I think that's what we did. So there was no audio. And sure enough, I got a call that they had caught a guy early in the morning after the theater had closed up on that roof trying to repair his transmitter. Well, what he did is he had the transmitter and it was broadcasting the audio of movies, and the layout of this drive-in theater was such that he could go up on a hill and see the movie on the screen over the fence of the drive-in theater, and that's how he was watching his movies without paying admission. So there were just a lot of strange things that we ran into at various times. We had two similar situations. I think it was Syracuse, New York, put in a system of sirens. Now, remember, this was back in the 50s when they were still concerned about Russia dominating the Russia sending airplanes over. There was a Conelrad system for alerts and so on. And of course, they had sirens set up. Well, at this time, the telephone company was converting from dial telephones to keypads. Well, those keypads turned out to be very useful for a number of things, as you know, besides just the telephone. So the keypad system, they figured out a way of setting up different telephone type numbers that they would send over the phone lines, or they would send by radio to sirens, to activate sirens in different parts of the city of Syracuse, New York, for various alerts and warnings and so on. And they had a code that would set them all off. They had codes that were for specific areas and so on. Well, it turns out that they tested it every Saturday at a certain time, and kids figured out what was going on, so they recorded the tones. And then they played them back about 3 o'clock in the morning and set all the sirens off in the city of Syracuse. Well, it turns out that the monitoring station of the public safety heard those tones go out, but they had no idea where they were coming from. So that was strange things happen. And anyways, the kids figured out how to do it, and they were setting off the sirens in Syracuse. So finally, they had to put in a much more sophisticated system of controlling their sirens, so that they weren't using just touch keypad tones broadcast to do it. And then a similar case happened in Erie, Pennsylvania, which was a different situation. The fire department transmitted PL tones and tones on their radios to switch the police to switch the traffic signals to all green or all in a certain direction when they were left the fire station. And I guess this is a rather common procedure. Well, again, some guy figured out how they were doing it and was able to figure out the PL tone and was driving around the city and changing the traffic lights to all green wherever he wanted to go. And of course, they figured it out quickly, but we never did find the guy who was doing it. I guess he got word that we were on his tail and stopped it. So that's another way somebody just for the fun of it was tearing up the violating the radio laws. We had one amateur case that was, well, it was not exactly an amateur case. I guess it was really an unlicensed case in a way, where a group of ham radio operators, they were on the HF band operating below the 80 meter band, but they were on phone, single sideband, and we called them the Ding-a-ling Network. And they were trying to use dirty language, about as dirty language as they possibly could, and making fun of the commission and of the FAA and the FCC and everyone else. And we got a lot of complaints from other hams that could hear him and wondered why we were letting them go on. So finally, our DF stations were able to DF it. One of the stations was near Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And finally, we had a sort of an idea of when they operated. I went down, it was usually between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And we DF'd it, and I got into the town where he was, and I DF'd it right to the house. And the fellow was operating on it. So we found out who owned the house. It was a lady. We knocked on the door. We got the lady up. She said, yeah, her son had a radio station in a back, like in a garage. And it was a sort of an outbuilding, a separate little building that he had where he was living. And so she took us out there, and we had the police with us. And we went in and caught him operating. And his transmitter was operating at about 35, right below the 80 meter band, and caught him while he was actually went in when he was on the air. But the thing is, he weighed about 400 pounds, and all over the wall in his room were pornographic pictures of women that were at least 300 pounds or so. I've never seen such a thing in my life, but that was a real mess. And of course, we put him in handcuffs, and off he went to the lockup in Buffalo. So that was the Ding-a-ling Net. And that's the only time I ever ran into anything like that, and I hope I never see it again. So, one of the more interesting problems that we ran into with actual operating was the FCC, or the government, decided to narrow the bands from plus or minus 15 kilohertz to plus or minus 5 kilohertz, and the marine radio services, the VHF marine radio services, up around 157, 162 in that range, and to enable the licensing of more marine stations. Well, the Great Lakes carriers, of course, all the stations had to convert from plus or minus 15 to plus or minus 5 kilohertz, and they have either new radios or have their rigs adjusted with limiters installed. And they did, and we inspected a lot of ship stations to determine compliance. We measured their modulation and so on. But the ship captains or the crew on the ships complained that that they could hardly hear the U.S. stations, but the Canadians, which were still operating plus or minus 15, had not all converted their stations yet, and that it blasted them out of the pilot house. It was very loud, and when they turned the volume down, they couldn't hear the calls from the U.S. stations, the U.S. ships. So there seemed to be a very wide divergency in the loudness of the signals. Well, I was given the job to ride on one of these lake carriers for a couple of weeks and listen to the communications and make measurements, modulation measurements on all the signals that I heard. We went from Chicago all the way up to the Sault Ste. Marie and down to Detroit, through Lake Erie and back again and on Lake Superior. And I was making all kinds of measurements and recording them. And it turns out that some of the Canadian stations were modulating not plus or minus 15, but were modulating plus or minus 40. And there was a very, very much difference. And that's why the ship operators were complaining of the wide difference in loudness, and why the commissioned rules for plus or minus 5 were a hazard to their safety. Well, I found out that the Canadian stations set up their modulation from their control stations, but their transmitters sometimes were 50, 100 or more miles away and connected by telephone lines. When the sun came out and the lines were just plain two-pair telephone lines, got hot, the resistance went way up and the volume went down. When they got in cold weather, and when it was cold, particularly in the Great Lakes, it got pretty darn cold, the resistance of those lines went way down, and the audio loss went way down, and the volume went way up. So it was a matter of whether those phone lines were hot or cold, and instead of putting limiters at the transmitter, they had put the limiters at the control station sites. And the Canadians had some of those lines were a couple of 100 miles long, the phone lines that went from the control station to the transmitter sites. So that was an interesting job of writing the ships and measuring the modulation of all of these ship communications. And so that was quite an experience, and the only one that I ever had of that case. But I had to actually go into a court, and there was a lawsuit against the commission, and I had to testify in the court that what I had found as a result of my measurements. And a funny thing, I used the word synchronize in my transcript or in my testimony, and when I read the transcript back as from the court proceedings, the person who the court clerk that takes the stenographer that takes the testimony wasn't very skilled in technical terms, and so instead of quoting the word synchronize, they put and Mr. Reiser reported that there was a nice sync at the Canadian station. So, instead of synchronize, it was a nice sync. So I remember we had to when the testimony when I read the testimony, and I sort of fell over when I saw that word, the way that they had transcribed it. So, well, anyway, those are some of the cases that I had. I told about the Pittsburgh. we got a call at the Buffalo field office one day from the Coast Guard station. And the Coast Guard told us that they were getting interference from a broadcast station. They heard the broadcast station on one of the Coast Guard had called scanners, and they listened not only to the regular marine channels, but they also listened to the telephone companies' two-way mobile radio, because a lot of times ship operators and so on, or ships would call distress on the telephone. Instead, they wouldn't have regular two-way radio, but they would have a telephone, a mobile telephone in the bell system in their boats or their big yachts, rather than having just regular marine radio. So the Coast Guard monitored the telephone company calls with a scanner. Well, they called and they said they were hearing this broadcast station, and we called the station and told them we're hearing them. They're causing interference on Marine Channel 44 or whatever it was. And I said, and the station said, no, we're not. There's nothing that we're doing. So they called us at the field office, and we tuned in to the frequency, and sure enough, we could hear music. Well, it turns out that the captain of the ship had been trying to get somebody at his office in his home office and had placed a telephone call. Well, the person that he was trying to get was on another call, and apparently it was a very long call. So of course this was when music on hold was new. So the company that he called had music on hold, and the music they were using was the local radio station. So the music coming over the transmitter from the two-way system from the telephone company was the music on hold going back to the ship. And that's what the Coast Guard was complaining about. And we finally sort of laughed about it, and we told them that there is nothing in the rules that permits a telephone call from playing music. And so that was perfectly normal, but the Coast Guard was quite upset that they were hearing music. The first time they had heard music on hold, I guess, on those frequencies. One of the things, of course, we did, particularly in the Detroit field office, was work with the Coast Guard and monitoring and going out with the Coast Guard on holiday weekends, because there would be a lot of boaters that had two-way radios in their boats, and they would get a little high and a little tipsy, so they would want to get everybody to get on the frequency and sing the Star Spangled Banner, or they would sing and do all kinds of things. And of course, it would interfere. Sometimes they would be on the distress frequency of 2182 or the 156.8 of distress frequencies, and get on and whoop it up. And so we would go out with the Coast Guard and DF and chase these some of these boaters down that were rather using strange operating practices when they were a little bit inebriated. So another case that was with the Coast Guard, and we did a lot of work with the Coast Guard, was in Rochester, New York. And I'm watching the time. I got about five minutes left. Buffalo, New York. The Coast Guard called and said, we are hearing AM radio stations, a mixture of AM radio stations on all of our marine frequencies from about 2 megahertz on up, 2182 and the whole works. And they seem to be about every 400 kilohertz apart. So we went over to Rochester and took our gear and our DF equipment and so on. And sure enough, you could hear these signals. It turns out that the AM stations in Rochester, New York, I think there are 4 of them, that are all about 400 kilohertz apart. So wherever there was any, conductive, any diode, bad diodes or bad electrical connections or so on, there would be the mixing of these AM stations, including a lot of old streetcar wires that had never been removed, that had been cut or taken down or left in place. But anyway, there was a lot of places in the city that we could find hot spots of a mixture of AM signals. Well, finally, we cleared up quite a few of them and finally got to one place where it was very strong. And it turns out this was a factory that made evening in Paris perfume and facial products, face powder, perfume, sachets, and different toiletries of that particular brand. And the signal was extremely strong. So we took our meter, we had a sensitive meter and tuned it to like 2182, walked in, and we found that the signal was coming out of a 4-inch sewer pipe that was going right up from through the building. We went up to the 4th floor and then we got onto the roof of the building, and we found that there was a water sink with a sump for rainwater to drain off the roof, and there was a copper flashing, and we gave the thing a big whack, and the interference completely disappeared. It was a bad connection between that copper flashing and the cast iron pipe that had gone down that was the drain. Well, so we solved the problem. We told them that they should get the thing fixed and welded and repaired, but it solved the problem. We reported the finding to the Coastguard. They were very happy. The interference quit, and so we headed home. Well, by that time, it was about 6:30 in the evening, and Bill Mintel, and who was the engineer with me, we stopped at a little diner near Batavia, New York, or between Rochester and Buffalo, to get a bite to eat. And we went in, and the waitress came over to us, and she looked at us, and she gave us sort of an awful funny look, and we couldn't figure out why it was going. And she kept looking back at us and so on, and we what's going on? Well, anyway, we got our sandwich and something to eat, a little supper, and I went home, and we went home, and I let Bill off at his house, and I drove the car back home, got out, and I walked in the door, and my wife was about ready to kill me. What have you been doing? It turns out that both of us reeked with perfume and the face powder odor, and that's why we didn't realize it, but that's why the waitress there thought we were something or other, because the way we smelled. Well, that's the last story I have for you this evening. I've got a few more, and maybe you'll invite me back sometime in the future. And when I do come back, I'll have some pictures of some of our equipment, and I'll show you my badge. I still have my inspector's badge, and I'll show you the things. So it's been great with you. Have a good evening, everyone. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, John. This has been so great. Such great stories you had to share. I for one, definitely want you to come back and tell some more and see some pictures and whatnot. And if you are so willing, at this point, I think we'll kind of close down our official meeting. But if you are so willing, we got people hanging around afterwards. I'm sure there's a few people who actually want to ask you a few questions. So
Okay.
Yeah,
be willing.
John, this is
I'd like to ask John a question.
Go for it.
K3MT. Hi, John. We worked together at the FCC in the 70s. Glad to see you again.
Good to see you. Oh, great. Okay.
Enjoyed it, John. Enjoyed it very much.
Oh, good to see you, Frank.
Good to see you too, John.
Yeah, John, this is Kevin, WB0POH. I had a couple of questions. One of them is roughly what year did that happen, that Syracuse incident happen?
What, the
sirens in Syracuse.
the sirens? It must have been around about 1970.
Yeah, okay, that's funny. I have an interesting story of my own that you might find interesting, John. I used to work for what used to be called Phelps Dodge Communications. It was Cell Wave when I was there.
Yeah, okay.
And what happened was we were doing business with Nextel, and Nextel's modulation for push to talk is nasty. And there was a big discussion, and the FCC was involved because apparently there was some interference in Phoenix at 24th Street and Camelback, and they were blaming it and was interfering with the mobile data terminals that they were using in the police cars.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what happened, they were blaming it on the Nextel radios because they're not very clean. They're 4 tones, each one with a quad quam. It's nasty modulation. But what happened was, but then I took a look at the radio and the front ends didn't exist. And it turned out that their interference source wasn't Nextel, because I actually helped install some of the filters for this transmitter. It's a paging transmitter at 24th Street and Camelback, 10-degree downhill antenna, 500 watts.
Oh, boy.
In other words, they had 5 or 6 kilowatts going into a front end that had no filtering, using gallium arsenide FETs with 5 volts. Like, no. Big interference problems.
Yeah. Very, very,
Yeah.
very funny.
Nextel was exonerated on that incident. Of course, they got kicked off the air other ways, but that was one time it was not Nextel.
I've got another interesting story about Syracuse. Yeah, do you remember the movie? Let's see, Play Misty for Me. It was Clint Eastwood movie. Yeah, there was a lady that had a passion for an announcer, and in this movie, okay, Play Misty for Me. But anyway, we got a call from a lady in Syracuse that, we got a call from the the wage and hours division of the state of New York, that the station in Syracuse was violating the laws because this announcer was on many hours, working many hours a day. And this lady got a passion on her and on him and waited outside the station. So when he came out, well, he never came. He didn't seem to come out. So she filed a complaint that the station was overworking him. And they called us and they said, well, we legally cannot make a station inspection for another government agency. But I will make it down and I'll just do another inspection, a broadcast inspection when we get there. We'll look into it and see what's going on. Well, it turns out it was an automated station, and the station was, everything was automated, and the announcer, of course, was pre-recorded, and he was an announcer in New York or someplace that did voiceover. And the problem was the station was supposed to rotate their tapes, but they were going broke. And so they were playing the same tape over and the same announcer over and over and over again, 24 hours. So it sounded like he was working 24 hours a day. And so she complained that they were overworking him. And that's all it was that it was a completely automated station. So funny things happen. And, but it was because she complained that the station was working the time overtime, and the state called us to see what we could do about it or what was going on. So I just reported back to what it was.
John has just scratched the surface of the annals of the FCC. There's tons of those stories.
Let's hear it for your stuff.
And thank you so much.
Okay, well, good night, everyone. I'm gonna go have a beer.